On the cold, misty morning of April 7, 1945, daybreak crept over the small German town of Alengrabo, roughly 43 miles west of Berlin. Hedwig Miller, 23, worn down by 3 years in service as a female auxiliary with the Wehrmacht, stood motionless at the window of a dilapidated schoolhouse that had served as her unit's dormitory for the past 6 months. What she saw through the cracked panes overturned 8 years of indoctrination and everything she believed about the Americans. Instead of the savage hordes described in Der Stürmer, instead of the gangster degenerates from propaganda reels, she saw the impossible. Tidy ranks of well-fed, well-equipped troops, uniforms neat and intact, vehicles plentiful and running. What stunned her most wasn't how they looked, it was what they did. American GIs were unloading crates from trucks, food, medicine, blankets. This wasn't the behavior of marauders come to plunder, it was the conduct of a force so lavishly supplied that it could afford to share with the very people it had defeated. They looked like giants, Hedwig would later write, not only in stature, but in their effortless confidence. They moved, she thought, like men who had never truly known hunger. And the trucks, so many trucks, kept arriving in an unending line, more than she had seen during the entire war. How had we been fighting such an enemy? What hope did we ever have? When she watched a black American soldier hand a chocolate bar to a cluster of exhausted German children, an awful realization took shape. The Reich that promised 1,000 years of glory couldn't even keep its female auxiliaries supplied with basic soap, yet these supposed inferiors were casually distributing more food in one morning than she had seen in months. As American military police set a security cordon around the women's quarters to shield them from reprisals, Hedwig understood they had been lied to about everything. The myth of German superiority collapsed before sights she could neither deny nor explain away: cartons of cigarettes, tins of coffee, white bread, and soldiers who smiled with every tooth. The liberation of roughly 19,000 Wehrmacht female auxiliaries in the final months of the war laid bare a jarring gulf between Nazi propaganda and Allied reality. These women, often mistakenly labeled comfort women by Allied troops who confused their clerical and communications duties with Imperial Japan's system of sexual slavery in the Pacific, experienced a particularly disorienting defeat. Unlike male soldiers captured in battle, they endured the collapse of their worldview more slowly and intimately, with ample time to compare what they'd been taught to what they now saw with their own eyes. The road to that revelation began years earlier, in the heady phase of National Socialist triumph. From 1933 onward, state messaging carefully crafted an image of Western opponents, especially Americans, as racially mixed, morally corrupt, and materially soft. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda produced over 1,000 films during the Nazi era. Many explicitly portrayed Americans as gangster-ridden, money-obsessed, and lacking the spiritual toughness for serious war. In Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, 1940, Americans appeared as puppets of financial interests, their wealth framed as moral rot, not industrial strength. Germans who grew up under this media climate had little access to contrary information. Like most female auxiliaries, Hedwig came of age as Hitler consolidated power. Her formative years coincided with the Reich's early wins: the remilitarization of the Rhineland, 1936, the Anschluss with Austria, 1938, the fall of France, 1940. Each apparent vindication of Nazi forecasts bolstered the credibility of other claims, including caricatures of American society. By 1941, over 100,000 German women were in uniformed auxiliary roles: communications, administration, medical support. Unlike the Soviet Union, which put women into combat as snipers and pilots, Nazi Germany largely kept functions segregated by gender, casting women explicitly in support roles. Training for auxiliaries ran about 4 weeks. Pay hovered around 160 to 200 Reichsmarks per month, adequate but hardly generous. Uniforms, designed for practicality yet meant to look feminine, embodied the regime's contradictory view of women's roles. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, propaganda pivoted to the new foe. Americans were painted as materialistic yet inept, awash in factory output but lacking the racial vigor and ideological resolve to use it. Nazi papers mocked US troops as cowboys and gangsters in uniform, unworthy of comparison with the disciplined German fighting man. Films like Kruger cast Americans and British as brutal colonizers, hinting Germans would face the same cruelty if beaten. Messaging intensified as US forces neared German soil. By early 1945, Goebbels's ministry distributed broadsides warning of rape, pillage, and executions should Americans occupy Germany. One widely circulated leaflet described mongrelized troops led by Jewish officers bent on exterminating the German people. For women like Hedwig and her fellow auxiliaries, these warnings landed with particular force, priming them to expect sexual violence and revenge. The reality they met was radically different. Lieutenant Thomas Hardgrove of the 89th Infantry Division recorded his first encounter with German female auxiliaries near Essen in April 1945. We found about 30 women in a communications bunker. They were terrified, bracing for the worst. Through our interpreter, we explained they'd be treated under the Geneva Convention, and you could see the relief. One woman burst into tears when offered a K ration. She kept repeating, "Es ist zu viel, it's too much," stunned by both the quantity and quality of standard-issue American field rations. Scenes like that repeated across Western Germany as US units advanced. Thousands of female auxiliaries failed to withdraw with German forces, some left behind amid chaos, others effectively abandoned as the Wehrmacht unraveled. Following established PAW protocols, Americans typically created separate detention areas for these women, with female MPs assigned when possible. Gretchen Kohler, a signals auxiliary captured near Frankfurt, described initial confinement in a letter smuggled to her family. "We're housed in a former hotel. Each of us has a real bed and clean sheets. We receive the same rations as US soldiers, more food than I've seen in a year. Yesterday they handed out chocolate and cigarettes as if such things had no value. When I asked why they wasted luxuries on prisoners, the guard looked puzzled. Lady, this isn't luxury where we come from. This is just Tuesday." That casual abundance was the first shock. Through 1944 to 45, civilian rations in Germany dwindled to about 1,500 calories per day, often less in practice. Military personnel fared marginally better, but by the war's end, even those allocations were erratic. Many auxiliaries lived in a state of chronic hunger, relying on the black market when connections or barter made it possible. By contrast, American field rations provided roughly 3,600 calories daily for active personnel, with supplements frequently available. Even a basic K ration, devised for frontline use, included items that had become rare luxuries in Germany: coffee, sugar, preserved meat, chocolate. For prisoners accustomed to thin soups and increasingly poor bread, US rations were not merely sufficient, they were unimaginable plenty. That nutritional gap pointed to deeper industrial disparities. By 1944, US factories turned out 50,000 plus military vehicles per month. German output for the entire year was roughly 27,000. The United States built over 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Germany manufactured about 39,000 across the entire war. Impressive on paper, these numbers became visceral to captured auxiliaries as they watched US logistics in motion. Ilse Weber, a communications specialist seized near Kassel, wrote in a diary later recovered by American intelligence. The Americans seem to have an inexhaustible supply of everything. Their trucks run constantly with no visible concern for fuel. If a vehicle has issues, they sometimes just leave it and take another. Yesterday I watched a supply sergeant toss out 15 pairs of boots for slight water damage. In Germany, those boots would have outfitted a platoon, and men would have fought for them. The abundance reached beyond equipment. Many auxiliaries remarked on the personal items US soldiers carried: changes of clothing, watches, cameras, fountain pens, and hygiene supplies that were scarce back home. Erika Schmidt, captured near Heidelberg, noted, "Every American soldier seems to have his own toothbrush, razor, and soap. They use fresh water to shave every day, while we were told civilians must save every drop." Our interpreter laughed and said, "In America, even poor people have running water." Perhaps most disorienting was the difference in health and physique. After years of propaganda about Nordic superiority, many women found themselves face to face with American soldiers who, on average, stood taller than Germans. Decades of better nutrition had produced a generation of Americans several centimeters taller on average, an advantage that appeared even starker as German diets deteriorated late in the war. For some, the racial dimension was the hardest collision with reality. A medical auxiliary, Helga Brandt, wrote, "We were taught that black soldiers were inherently inferior. Yet they are tall, strong, well-fed, many speak better German than some Americans of German descent, and they operate complicated equipment confidently. We saw none of the mental deficiency we had been told was typical." Confronted with professional, respectful treatment by black GIs, rather than the bestial behavior propaganda had promised, many experienced profound cognitive dissonance. The Reich's racial hierarchy, presented as scientific truth, crumbled when tested against living evidence. Once that certainty fell, other ideological pillars began to loosen as well. As spring turned into summer 1945, the situation of captured auxiliaries evolved. Ad hoc holding sites gave way to more organized internment facilities, and American authorities established screening to identify women with significant Nazi Party involvement or intelligence value. For most, captivity became a daily lesson in American industrial power and logistical skill rather than a tale of abuse. Camp Westbrook, set up in a former Luftwaffe training school near Wiesbaden, housed more than 2,000 female auxiliaries by June 1945. Administered under the Women's Army Corps, the camp maintained separate barracks for officers and enlisted women, retaining German military hierarchy on paper while introducing distinctly American routines. Margaret Kunze, a signals lieutenant interned there, described the schedule. "We rise at 6, perform light duties until 4, and evenings are our own. The work is simple compared to our service tasks, keeping our spaces clean, assisting in the kitchen. There's a library with German books, a recreation area, and twice-weekly film showings. They call this detention, yet it's more comfortable than my family's life for years." The medical section proved even more revealing. Many arrivals showed the long toll of stress and poor nutrition, dental decay, amenorrhea, vitamin deficiencies, untreated chronic ailments. Following standard POW procedures, American medical staff provided care that surpassed what many had received on active duty. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, U.S. Army Medical Corps, recorded initial findings. Roughly 68% show some form of malnutrition. Dental problems are nearly universal, on average 3 untreated caries per patient. Signs of past frostbite are common, especially among those who served near the Eastern Front. Psychological symptoms, hypervigilance, sleep disruption, anxiety, track with prolonged combat exposure, though without the recognition or treatment male soldiers might receive. Treatment added another layer to the contrast. Clinics dispensed antibiotics, analgesics, and vitamins in quantities that felt extravagant to women used to rationed medicine. Dental work, largely unavailable to German civilians by war's end, became routine. By July 1945, the average internee at Westbrook had gained about 4 kilograms, visible proof of improved nutrition that no ideology could explain away. The supply chain itself served as a running demonstration of American logistics. Regular deliveries of food, medication, and equipment arrived on predictable timetables, starkly different from the increasingly erratic supply the women had known. The Americans kept steady lines of communication through conquered territory and coordinated transport across hundreds of miles, undermining Goebbels's caricature of U.S. organizational incompetence. "They waste so much," noted Gertrude Meyer, a former quartermaster assistant, "and yet their waste management is strangely efficient. They sort it, move it, and remove it daily with dedicated vehicles. Even their refuse shows a kind of order we struggle to maintain at our peak." By midsummer, American authorities introduced re-education programs for interned personnel, including the auxiliaries. Designed to support denazification and prepare prisoners for civilian life, these programs exposed audiences to information previously suppressed or twisted by the regime. Documentary screenings proved especially effective. Films on U.S. factories, farms, and universities, footage of everyday democratic institutions, and crucially, documentation of Nazi atrocities. While some women dismissed it as new propaganda, many found their growing doubts impossible to ignore in the face of mounting, tangible evidence. Brigitte Hoffmann, a former party member who had served as a signals auxiliary in France, described the pivot. They showed us a Detroit plant that churned out more vehicles in 1 month than all of Germany produced in our final year. They showed full stores, coeducational universities, and then they showed Buchenwald. I vomited and did not sleep for 3 nights. Everything had been a lie for others. Change came more gradually, through countless small collisions with reality, rather than a single shattering moment. Casual interactions among American personnel of different races, a relatively informal rapport between officers and enlisted, the matter-of-fact competence of female US service members, each chipped away at a worldview built by years of schooling and media control. Letters home, censored but typically permitted, trace that shift. Early messages often echoed familiar stereotypes about American morality or culture over time. They show a move toward acknowledging strengths, questioning assumptions, and revising beliefs. Hella Fischer wrote to her mother in Munich in August 1945. They surprised me again. Last week, their military band played Beethoven and Mozart, not only the jazz we expected. The conductor, Lieutenant Cohen, praised German musical heritage, this from a Jewish officer whose family likely suffered under our laws. It forces hard questions about what we were told. By autumn 1945, US forces began releasing auxiliaries deemed low risk. Many returned to ruined neighborhoods and fractured families, bringing home not only restored weight, treated illnesses, and small hordes of gifts from American personnel, but also revised perspectives. Those changes sometimes clashed with the experiences of people who had not seen what the women had. Erica Brown, back in Hanover in October, met disbelief. My father would not accept what I said about American supplies. He accused me of exaggeration or delusion. When I showed him the cigarettes and chocolate I was given upon release, he insisted, "These must have been produced in German factories captured by the Allies." He cannot accept that our enemies had such abundance while we lived with less and less. That disconnect added another layer to Germany's collective psychological adjustment. Civilians who had known only air raids and shortages found it hard to reconcile the idea of American generosity with their own suffering. Women who spoke positively about captivity sometimes faced accusations of collaboration or moral compromise. Louise Hoffman, freed from Camp Marshall near Stuttgart in November 1945, wrote, "My neighbors watch me with suspicion. Because I won't join their bitter complaints about the occupation, they whisper that I must have traded honor for favors. They cannot grasp that I do not hate our conquerors, not because I lack patriotism, but because I have seen that much of what defined our patriotism rested on falsehoods." For American authorities, the auxiliaries' experience offered insight into the psychology of occupation and reconstruction. Studies by the Strategic Services Unit's successor to the OSS mapped the women's changing views and identified factors that accelerated or hindered ideological change. Those findings informed broader denazification policies and deepened understanding of how belief systems give way under contradictory evidence. Dr. Margarete Hoffmann, a German-born psychologist working with the US military government, interviewed more than 300 former auxiliaries in early 1946. Her report, Transformation of Belief Through Material Evidence, highlighted a key pattern: the ordinary persuades. Hot water on demand, the casual distribution of food, the routine replacement of damaged equipment, these mundane demonstrations eroded ideological certainty better than abstract political arguments. The same dynamic played out across post-war West Germany. As US policy shifted from early harshness to the support embodied in the Marshall Plan, material reconstruction created the setting for psychological and political reorientation. The practical success of democratic market economies, first visible to internees with direct exposure, gradually became clear nationwide, easing acceptance of new institutions. Hedwig Müller, whose dawn encounter opened this account, embodied that arc. After 6 months in US custody, she returned to Bavaria with markedly altered views. In 1948, she applied for a civilian position with the American Occupation Authority, eventually serving as an administrative assistant at the Munich consulate. In 1952, she married James Lawrence, a former Army sergeant who had returned as a civilian contractor. By 1955, they settled in Columbus, Ohio, part of a migration echoed by roughly 4,000 former auxiliaries who married Americans. In a 1977 interview with the Ohio Historical Society, she reflected, "People asked if I was afraid when the Americans arrived. Of course. We had been told they would destroy everything we valued. Instead, they shared what they had. My first chocolate bar, from a soldier who didn't even want thanks, contained more truth about America than all of Goebbels' speeches. I learned that abundance can breed generosity, while scarcity fuels the fear tyrants exploit. That is the lesson I carried to my new home. The auxiliaries' stories offer a distinctive window on defeat and ideological collapse. Unlike formal military surrenders, their reckoning unfolded in an intimate, prolonged confrontation between indoctrinated expectations and lived reality. Their testimonies show how material evidence, the undeniable presence of American plenty contrasted with German want, can undercut abstract dogma more effectively than direct debate. That process mirrors Germany's broader post-war journey. The Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s, aided by Marshall Plan funds and currency reform, created material conditions that supported political rehabilitation. West Germany's integration into democratic institutions and a market economy rested on the same logic the auxiliaries experienced firsthand. Working systems persuade. The irony is sharp. National Socialism had exalted sacrifice and scorned American abundance as moral weakness. Yet abundance, when encountered directly, revealed organizational competence, industrial capacity, and social cohesion, the very qualities the Reich claimed as uniquely German. The chocolate bars, cigarettes, and K-rations pressed into astonished hands carried more than calories. They exposed the bankruptcy of a worldview built in opposition to a caricature of materialists. 76 years on, fewer than 100 former auxiliaries remain, most in their late 90s. Their accounts, the shock of encountering plenty amid defeat, the slow pivot from belief to doubt to re-evaluation, help explain how convictions crumble and reform. They trace Germany's 20th century arc in microcosm. Their voices remind us that even fervent commitments yield to contradictory experience, especially when that experience is personal rather than mediated. The American soldiers casually handing out chocolate accomplished what counter-propaganda could not. They made the abstract concrete, turning an enemy from myth into human beings. The physicist Lise Meitner, who fled Nazi Germany in 1938, once observed that reality doesn't vanish when you stop believing in it. For Wehrmacht auxiliaries, that reality arrived with liberation, not as a theory, but as chocolate bars, antibiotics, and running trucks, evidence no creed could wish away. In that disillusionment were the seeds of reconstruction. The Reich's enforced austerity, meant to forge spiritual strength, may in fact have hastened ideological collapse by creating a stark contrast that made American plenty more shocking and thus more persuasive when finally seen. A regime that promised greatness through struggle watched former adherents converted by ordinary comforts long taken for granted in open societies. In the end, chocolate and hot water proved more potent than slogans. Meeting basic human needs can secure loyalties that fear and deprivation never sustain. For women like Hedwig Miller, the path from Wehrmacht auxiliary to American citizen was more than a change of geography. It was a fundamental reassessment of values, priorities, and possibilities, a transformation sparked by liberation and sustained by the evident benefits of alternative arrangements. In her Midwestern community, she found not the spiritual emptiness Nazi ideology predicted, but dignity, opportunity, and security. Multiply that experience across thousands, and you glimpse how personal reckonings helped rebuild a nation and normalize relations between former enemies. When Chancellor Konrad Adenauer visited Washington in 1953, his delegation included 3 former auxiliaries who had married Americans and become U.S. citizens, a small but telling symbol of lives at the crossroads of defeat and integration. Their stories underscore that history turns not only on treaties and constitutions, but on countless private encounters with changing reality. The women who watched, amazed, as American soldiers handed out unimaginable abundance experienced defeat, not as an abstract national failure, but as a concrete revelation, a painful, liberating discovery that much of what they had believed was built on falsehoods. In that recognition lay both trauma and opportunity, the collapse of one worldview and the careful construction of another. For societies emerging from authoritarian rule, their experience offers a durable lesson. Ideologies rarely fall to argument alone. They yield to tangible alternatives, to ways of living people can see, touch, and taste. Where scarcity is enforced to sustain power and information is engineered to harden beliefs, the possibility remains for moments when reality breaks through, beginning the slow work of disillusionment and rebuilding. Those chocolate bars handed out in 1945 carried more than sugar and cocoa. They conveyed an implicit message about another way to organize society. For women raised to venerate austerity and sacrifice, these simple gifts challenged everything they had been taught. In their astonishment lay the beginnings of a new understanding: that abundance can be more persuasive than austerity, generosity can achieve what force cannot, and societies ordered around well-being rather than mythic struggle may better serve human needs. As the last witnesses pass from the stage, their testimonies remind us how quickly permanent systems can collapse under the weight of contrary facts, and how resilient people can be in crafting new understandings from the rubble of discredited beliefs.